I wanted to cover the topic of internet governance, which is kind of my stuff, really, in that quite a bit of my research has been in this area. My PhD actually related to this area about a dozen years or so ago now, but I've worked on this stuff since, and I've published on this stuff since. And internet governance it's an interesting area in its own right, and it's an important area in its own right because of the importance of the internet to modern society. But it's also a useful case study for helping us to understand some wider issues in global governance. So thinking about what we mean by global governance or governance in general. Sometimes you'll see the word governance used as a substitute for government, but it doesn't actually mean the same thing. Thanks very much. So I'm not sure who's the pen is. It's not sure I can. So yeah, I mean sometimes the term governance is used as a substitute for government, but it doesn't actually mean the same thing. Governance comes from a Latin phrase, gubernare, which literally means to steer. And I can't remember who said this, but that has been used to kind of sum up what governance is about, the idea of steering, not rowing. What do we mean by that? Well, governance it's about creating order, it's about creating regulations, but it's not necessarily top-down. And that's the difference between governance and government. Government is top-down. It's about having a hierarchy. It's about having someone at the top, essentially giving orders, creating laws, creating rules, and so on. Governance is not necessarily like that. Governance can be about peer actors creating rules between them, through discussions, through interactions. And the actors are not necessarily always governments either. They may be, but they may also be private sector actors. The idea of private governance, private sector governance, or what we call public-private governance. The idea of kind of a hybrid system where both governmental and non-governmental actors are involved. And internet governance is a good example of that. So let's consider then, okay, what is the internet? Which might seem a silly question because we all use the internet every day. We think we know what it is. But actually, most people never kind of pause to think, well, what is happening behind the scenes? What is the internet really, and how is it organised, and how does it work? And again, I don't want to kind of go into too much of a technical level. I mean, I used to do this many years ago, in a previous life, before I went back into academia. I actually was a network technician for some years, so actually I did this stuff, at the coalface, as it were. That's going back 20 years and more. But things have not fundamentally changed. I mean, technology has moved on to some extent, but the basics are pretty much the same. So the internet is sometimes referred to as a network, as a wide area network, but actually it's more of a network of networks. It's not a single thing. It's made up of many different networks in many different parts of the world, and of course those networks are all owned by different entities. Some of them are governmentally owned, some of them are privately owned. Big networks owned by, for example, the universities network, the JANET, the Joint Academic Network, or networks owned by your ISP, for example. So if you're on, Virgin or BT or, whatever ISP you're with, they have their own network which then plugs into the wider internet. So the internet is a network of networks. And we can kind of conceptualise it at different levels. So at the kind of physical level, of course, it's the wires, the connections, the servers, the routers. It's the stuff that exists physically and plugs together. But the hardware is useless without the software, of course. It's the software standards and what we call the internet protocols, which allow communication to take place across the networks. What is a protocol? It's a set of standards for communication. You can think of it as kind of like a language, if you like, an electronic, a computer language. And of course, for two computers to communicate, they have to be using the same language, the same protocols. Without that common set of rules, communication would not be possible. So in order for the global internet to work, someone's got to coordinate this. Someone has to coordinate, you know, the technical standards, the protocols, the IP addressing, the domain name system. All that has to be coordinated for it to work. So who is that somebody? So again, the internet has no single owner, it has no single controlling body. Some people think that the internet ought to come under the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, which is the communications agency of the UN, but it doesn't. And instead, there are, you know, different internet governance bodies dealing with different aspects of internet governance. So that's kind of a logical map of the internet. It kind of looks like a map of the cosmos, or maybe the human brain, but in actual fact each one of these points of light is a network. And again, you can see some are bigger than others, and they're all connected together in kind of a spider's web. Now, in days of yore, there was something called the internet backbone. If you kind of go back to the 1990s, 1960s to 1990s, there was a single backbone which was located in the US, and basically all of the internet traffic in the world was routed through this single backbone. Those days are long gone. These days ISPs connect to other ISPs, networks connect to other networks through what we call IXPs, internet exchange points, and as you can see there are a myriad of those. So everyone's network plugged into everyone else's at multiple different points. Again, you may get networks which are kind of semi-isolated. So, for example, the Chinese government, I mean, I don't know where that actually is, but let's say that represents the Chinese internet. The Chinese government is very careful that the Chinese national network is only plugged into the wider internet at a few places, and those places are monitored. Traffic is monitored, again, to try to restrict and control what Chinese citizens can see and access. Not always successfully, but that's the goal. So the internet, you know, is not a new thing in the sense that it has been around in some form or another since 1969. So, you know, well over half a century. But it only really became mainstream from the end of the 1990s, round about 2000. I mean, I can certainly remember getting my first internet connection, home connection, back in 2000. I previously used the internet at uni, and I was at uni as a student, 95 to 98, and we had the internet then at uni, but it was very, very, very primitive by modern standards. But it really kind of came on in leaps and bounds, you know, around the year 2000, although still primitive by today's standards, but starting to become something a bit more recognisable to us today from about 2000 onwards. But even at that point, it was still a bit of a novelty. I would say it didn't really become critical infrastructure that everyone relied on until about 2005 to 2010. Since then, of course, it has become, you know, increasingly critical infrastructure. And these days, you know, we can't really live without it, which arguably is a bit of a problem, because we've just seen what happened in Europe, of course, when in Spain and Portugal and parts of France, when the power went off. You know, it is a huge vulnerability because we are so reliant on electronic communications. If they stop working for whatever reason, we've suddenly got a big problem because we don't have a backup anymore. So yeah, the emergence of the internet has created a huge range of social and political issues, which again we don't have time to go into depth on those. But again, this is another reason, apart from technical reasons, but this is another reason why there is a need for regulation. So what do we mean by internet governance? So again, this is not necessarily the only possible definition, but this is the one which was reached by the UN's Working Group on Internet Governance ahead of the World Summit on the Information Society in 2005, which was kind of the first big international summit on internet governance. So the definition that they reached was that internet governance is the development and application by governments, the private sector and civil society in their respective roles have shared principles, norms, rules and decision-making procedures and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. Now that's interesting wording, because that wording is very similar to the wording used by Stephen Krasner, who defined the idea of an international regime. What do we mean by an international regime? We mean a set of arrangements for governing a particular issue area. And again, that might be embodied in a formal organisation, or it might not. Sometimes it's about informal rules of the game. But the idea of principles, norms, rules and decision-making procedures that govern this particular issue area. So Yochai Benkler conceptualised, and this is quite a useful model. It's not a perfect model, but it is a useful way to, to conceptualise internet governance in your mind. So Benkler conceptualised internet governance as being composed of 3 layers. So at one level, you've got the physical infrastructure. So again, the physical hardware, the cables, the routers, the servers, the wireless connections, and so on. Then we've got the what Benkler calls the code layer, or the logical layer, which basically means the software, which sits on top of the hardware. But then, of course, there's the actual stuff that we're interested in, the content layer, the actual information and data which is transmitted across the network. So again, regulation is required at each one of these levels, and we can conceptualise internet governance as existing at each of these levels. So yeah, we've mentioned the physical infrastructure layer. So again, the physical stuff is owned by, or is controlled by whoever owns the network, but of course it also needs to be able to plug together. So there needs to be common standards. And that's where organisations like the ITU come in terms of intergovernmental regulation, the ITU being a UN agency, but we've also got industry standards bodies, so private sector bodies, but still important in setting protocol standards, like the ISO, the International Organisation for Standardisation. In terms of the software layer, some of the key players in terms of setting the software standards are bodies, technical bodies such as the Internet Engineering Task Force and the Internet Architecture Board. Now, they grew up pretty much organically on a pretty much ad hoc basis. It wasn't organised, it wasn't a case of governments getting together and saying, let's create a treaty and we'll set these bodies up. They just kind of evolved out of the technical community. The internet evolved in a very kind of ad hoc kind of way. And that's important to understanding how it is governed, it's understanding its origin and where it came from. And again, you go back to pre-2000, the internet was very much, it was about scientists, it was about geeks, it was about the military to some extent. It wasn't mainstream, and it was very informal kind of organisation among the technical community, and that kind of developed over time into bodies like the IETF and the IAB. But then we have the addressing system, which is very important as well. Every machine connected to the internet needs to have an IP address, an internet protocol address. And there can't be duplicate addresses on the network. There are ways of doing that, but basically everyone has to have a unique address. Why? Because you can't communicate if there are multiple people with the same address. Think of it as being like a physical postal address. Okay, there might be, you might live in house number 9, and there might be, millions of house number 9s in the world. But then you might live in, number 9 Park Street, for example. There might be quite a lot of Park Streets in the world, but then you've got a postcode, or you've got your city name, or whatever. So ultimately, you've got a unique address. So if someone posts a letter to you, it's coming to you, because there's only one address, full address, which the letter can go to. Well, IP addresses work in the same way. So communication, as far as computers are concerned, communication using IP addresses alone is absolutely fine. You can go online, you can find a website using nothing but the IP address. But that's not convenient for human users. It's fine for machines, but humans don't tend to work that way. We don't tend to be good at keeping lots of long numbers in our head and remembering those. So instead, we have something called the domain name system, the DNS, which he kind of links, and the two are connected, links user-friendly names to IP addresses. And of course we use it every day. Every time you put a URL, a web address in, you're using the domain name system. Every time you send an email, you're using the domain name system. So the DNS, the IP addressing system, is kind of coordinated by a hierarchy of organisations across the world, but at the top level it's coordinated by an organisation called ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which incidentally was the subject of my PhD. So ICANN is a very interesting organisation because, again, it's a public-private partnership. It is not controlled by governments. Governments have a voice within ICANN, but they don't control ICANN. So yeah, there are lots of different organisations and bodies which control different aspects of internet governance, but there's no one overall authority at global level. Some people think there should be, some people think that should be the ITU, but as things stand, that's not the case. And again, control of the internet has to be global if you think about it. You know, it's not something that can be effectively controlled at the national level. Why? Because the nation-state system means that a state's jurisdiction stops at its own borders, but of course the internet doesn't stop at the border. The internet is, by its nature, is borderless. Okay, governments can try to control it within their own borders, and they do. Again, China is probably the best, most developed example. The Golden Shield project, the so-called Great Firewall of China, they try to control what comes in and what goes out of the country. But even then, you know, they can't really do it, you know, to a foolproof degree. So, and again, getting agreement between governments is impossible because different governments have different priorities. Some want free speech to a large extent, some want to kind of really restrict what people can view. Certain types of content are no problem in one jurisdiction, but a big problem in another jurisdiction. So you'll never get an agreement among governments. So again, governments have tended to not really control the internet, although they would like to. To a very large degree, the internet is an anarchic system, again with no one body or organisation in control of it. But again, it's very much internet governance is very much about partnerships between different types of actors, and this is what we call the multi-stakeholder model. So yes, governments and international organisations have a voice, but the private sector is very important as well, particularly the big tech companies. The technical community, which there's some overlap with the big tech companies, but we can also see them as kind of a body in their own right. The geeks, you know, the boffins, the guys with the the calculators who kind of make it all work. Academia has always been a big player in internet governance. Again, to a large extent, was an academic network for a long time. I mean, originally, what became the internet, the ARPANET, started off with the US Department of Defence, but through the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was largely an academic network, and academics still have a big voice in it. And then we've got us, civil society, ordinary internet users, the so-called netizens, the users of the net. So all of these stakeholders potentially have a voice in internet governance. I'm going to briefly introduce a few internet governance bodies. I'm not going to go into detail about them because, again, we don't have a lot of time. The first is the ITU. So I've mentioned the ITU already. The ITU is one of the oldest international organisations in existence. It dates back to the 1860s. So although today it is a UN agency, it's actually much older than the UN. It's been around longer than the UN has by quite a long way. It started off as the International Telegraph Union, which, if you think about it, the telegraph of the mid-19th century was the first electronic communication. And of course then followed by telephones and radio and television, and then ultimately digital communications. So again, the ITU doesn't control the internet. It would like to, but it doesn't. But it does nonetheless have an influence because the standards that it sets, particularly for hardware, obviously influence internet development and usage. We've got then, I've already mentioned the IETF, the IRTF. Again, these are basically geeks, these are the technical guys. They come under an umbrella organisation called ISOC, the Internet Society, which acts as kind of the administrative umbrella coordinating the work of IETF and IRTF and so on. Now, ISOC is made up of both corporate and individual members. So companies can be members of ISOC, so can individuals. You can join ISOC if you want to. I'm a member of ISOC. If you want to be a member of ISOC, you can join it. Anyone can. Then we have ICANN. So again, I've already mentioned ICANN, which coordinates the domain name system and the IP addressing system as well. Again, ICANN's work is very important and very political, in that, you know, this is not just about technical coordination. We're talking about political issues here, because we're talking about who gets what, who gets access to what resources. So, for example, Apple.com, you know, that name is very, very valuable, you know, because, again, okay, there are lots of top-level domains. By top-level domain, we mean the .com, you know. There are lots of top-level domains now, so you could have apple.org, you could have apple.info, you could have apple.biz, you can, you know, lots of different ones. But the premium one is still seen as .com. .com is still seen as the prime real estate. So there can only be one. Again, you can't have multiple apple.coms, it wouldn't work, you know. So there can only be one. But who gets that name? Currently, it belongs to Apple Incorporated, of course. But, you know, why? Why should they get the name? Why not Apple Records? Why not the Apple Growers Association? You know? Or if you think of a name like United.com, you know, there are multiple football clubs that would like that name. You know, but also United Airlines, United Carpets, United Movers. There are lots of organisations that potentially have a claim to that name. So who gets it? Because only one of them can have it. So again, this is kind of a political decision. You could say, well, it's first come, first served. It goes to whoever registered it first. But then you end up with the issue of cyber squatting, and that was a big thing in the 90s. You want to get rich in the 90s, just register Tesco.com. And Tesco says, oh, we want that name. Oh, that's great, just give me 10 million quid and you can have it, you know. And people did that. They can't anymore, because again, ICANN has policies to stop that. But back in the day, you know, that was what was called cyber squatting. People seeing which way the wind was blowing, you know, realised early on the internet is going to be big. Let's buy up all the names, Asda.com, Tesco.com, you know, Ford.com or whatever, and then, you know, charge whatever we like to sell them on to companies. So yeah, cyber squatting was an issue which had to be dealt with. So again, you know, ICANN's policies determine who gets what name, and this is important because it comes down to business opportunities for a start. Having the right name is a big factor in being found and being visible online. And again, not just for businesses, you know, for online identities, for freedom of expression, you know, for various groups of people, you know, being able to have an online identity. You know, names are important. And in a digital age, therefore domain names are important. So in deciding issues like these, ICANN is making decisions that are inherently political. It's not just technical coordination. So very briefly, this is how ICANN works, and again, I'm not going to go into any depth, but very briefly, ICANN's controlling body is its board of directors. I think there are 19 now. There used to be 15, but they expanded it. I think there are 19 directors now, plus various non-voting observers. They ultimately have the final decision-making authority in ICANN. What they say goes. What the board decides is what happens. But who are the board, and who puts proposals to the board? Who elects the board? Well, the board are chosen mainly by the supporting organisations. There's the address supporting organisation, which is made up of what's called the regional internet registries, the sort of technical coordinators around the world that hand out IP addresses. You've got the generic name supporting organisation, they do the GNSO, they deal with generic top-level domains like .com or .info or .base, and then you've got the country code name supporting organisation, they deal with country code top-level domain names like .uk. And particularly in the GNSO, again, there's representation for lots of different interests, so business, non-commercial users, the internet registries, internet registrars, the industry people, and so on. Lots of different groups represented there. Basically, they choose the board. They also make policy recommendations, which they submit to the board. The board considers them. Then there are various advisory committees, which also advise the board on policy. One of those is the GAC, the Governmental Advisory Committee. This is where governments have a voice in ICANN. But once again, governments can't overrule the board. This is an organisation where governments don't have the power. So if all of the governments in the world say, we want X, the board's probably not going to ignore that, but ultimately it's not obliged to do what governments say. Ultimately it's down to the board. Then we have the ALAC, the At-Large Advisory Committee, which is about the internet use in public. It's about me and you. We can be members of the ALAC. And then there are various technical committees, ICANN staff, which kind of are the civil service, the admin side of things, the IETF liaison, various technical committees, and so on. But the point I'm making here, again, the board is all powerful. This is not controlled by governments. It's not controlled. It's a public-private partnership. So all of this sounds great, yeah? What are the problems with this then? What are the issues with this? Well, the big problem is the lack of accountability. Who are these people? I'm guessing you've probably never heard of ICANN. Most people have never heard of ICANN. Yeah, it's a very important organisation. It makes decisions that potentially affect our lives and other people's lives. But who are they? Nobody even knows that they exist. That's a problem. That's a big democratic deficit. Because no one knows that they exist, and because corporations have so much of a big voice in them, again, there's this danger of corporate capture. There's this danger that big corporations, big business, are effectively going to be controlling these organisations and running it for their own benefit. Wealthy, big companies, mostly based in the global north, mostly based in North America and Europe and Japan to some extent, are calling the shots. So again, this is a problem, because if we believe in democracy and we believe in principles of democracy, that implies accountability, that decision makers should be accountable to those affected by their decisions. And again, ICANN claims that that's the case, because we have all of these different stakeholders, and we have the At-Large Advisory Committee, so anyone can join that, and we have the GAC, so we do have a governmental voice and so on. But the reality is that bodies like ICANN, and again this is what I kind of showed in my PhD project, very often controlled by self-selected, unrepresentative elites. This is a problem. So the Public Policy Authority wielded, and again this is just one example, and it's not just confined to internet governance. In many different areas of global governance, we're seeing the rise of this public-private or private authority, which again is really, making important decisions which affect people's lives in significant ways, and yet accountable to no one, really. That's a problem. That's a democratic deficit. So what do we do about it? Well, again, one option will be an intergovernmental alternative. Traditionally, the nation-state has been the mechanism for accountability. If particularly we live in a democracy, we elect a government, we can hold that government accountable. And so people who say, well, internet governance should be controlled by an intergovernmental body are working on that principle. If the internet was controlled by an international organisation which was accountable to governments, the government's ultimately accountable to the people, then we have democratic legitimacy, we have democratic accountability. But of course there's a problem there, because first of all many governments are not democratic anyway, so a country like China would have a big voice on this Internet Governing Council, China, of course, is not a democracy, and many of the states represented would not be democracies. So again, if you put states in charge, you're going to get the likes of China wanting to use that power to censor the internet and censor free speech, censor what people can access, so that's going to be a problem as well. And again, finding agreement among governments is going to be difficult also. And not only that, and again, this is not just about internet governance, this is true of any international body. You know, how accountable are these people really? So you've got, for example, on the ITU or various other UN agencies, you've got a British representative there, and that British representative is a civil servant who is accountable in theory to the Foreign Office and the Foreign Secretary, and the Foreign Secretary is accountable to Parliament, and Parliament is accountable to the people. But that's a very long chain. You know, the connection is not direct. And in reality, most of the general public, I don't know who the British representative to the ITU is. You know, it's very obscure. I have no idea. So the average member of the public is not likely to have any idea either. So this is the problem. International bureaucracies like these, and again, it's not just confined to internet governance, it's confined to any international organisation. In practice, they're very often almost like private clubs, and in theory there is a chain of accountability back to the people, but in reality, how accountable are they? So, is there an alternative to the intergovernmental model, to the multi-stakeholder model? Well, what about the idea of democratisation? What if an organisation like ICANN, the board of directors, could be elected by us, by the global internet using public? Now again, that might sound like a radical idea, but it's been tried, and with some success. In the early days of ICANN, so ICANN came into being in 1998, it took over the IP address and domain name function from the US government. Prior to that, again, because the internet started as a US Department of Defense network, the US government contracted it out to the University of California for years, what was called the IANA, and a guy called John Postel. But since 1998, it's been ICANN's job, and in the early days of ICANN, the organisation's constitution provided for some of the board to be directly elected by the global internet using public, and they actually did this in the year 2000. They carried out a global election, so anyone over the age of 16 with an email address and a physical address could register to be a voter. Around 158,000 people applied. The election was held in October 2000. About 34,000 people actually voted. Now again, that's a bit of an issue in that, you know, that's a very low turnout. I mean, even then, in 2000, there were something close to 1 billion internet users, even then. So 34,000 represents a tiny proportion of them, really. So that is an issue, you know, but arguably was more legitimate than anything previous to that. And 5 directors were actually elected, representing North America, Europe, Asia Pacific, South America and Africa. 5 constituencies. So in analysing that election, again, you know, some people were sceptical about it, but some people saw it as a big positive. So Hans Klein, for example, said, well, this is fantastic, you know, this is a proof of concept that democracy at the global level can work. Again, we're talking about the sectoral nature of globalism. So we're not talking about electing a world government, you know, with general authority over everything. That's not likely in the near future. But in specialised issue areas like internet governance, but many others as well, it is possible for people around the world using internet technology to directly elect representatives. And again, yes, you've got to get past the, you know, you've got to kind of make people aware of it to start with. People are, you know, it's not very democratic if no one knows that it exists. So first of all, you've got to publicise it. People have got to know that it's there, and you have to get them to actually take an interest and vote. But if you can do that, you know, then effectively you've got a level of global democracy, which again is a very different concept to the nationally and locally based democracies that we've had up until now. So potentially revolutionary. Unfortunately, it didn't last because the at-large elections were scrapped in 2002. Various reasons were cited: the fairness, representativeness, validity and affordability of global online elections against an easily capturable pool of self-selected and largely unverifiable voters. But again, these changes were criticised for having tipped the balance of power away from the internet using public and towards governments, but particularly towards certain business interests. So that was 25 years ago. I think it's time to revisit that experiment. I think it was successful enough last time that it could be and ought to be tried again. I don't think any problems with that election were identified that were insurmountable. Yes, there were issues that need to be worked on, but I don't see any good reason why ICANN's board of directors couldn't be elected by us once again. And again, this is important because directors elected and able to be dismissed by a popular electorate are going to have to listen to the concerns of ordinary internet users as opposed to the concerns of big corporations. It will provide a huge counterweight to corporate influence, and it will provide a level of accountability which currently doesn't exist and which governments can't really provide. And again, the broader implications of this, ICANN could act as a test bed for further experiments in global democracy in other sectors as well. So again, it's kind of sectoral nature. It deals with a limited area, but it's very, very powerful within that area. And the nature of the internet itself means that online voting is for the first time feasible. I think that experiment should be revisited, and I think it would be a useful test bed for the expansion of democracy in other areas of global governance. So we're getting a little bit short on time, so I'm just going to run through quickly some further kind of key ongoing issues in internet governance. So again, content regulation, obviously a huge one. There is no single content regulator. There are various entities that could regulate content to an extent. So again, we have things like the Convention on Cybercrime, which only bans certain things, but there are certain things that are certain types of content which are illegal more or less everywhere, and more or less everyone agrees should be illegal. So things like child porn, for example, things like terrorist content. Pretty much everyone agrees that should be illegal, so there's not much controversy about that. Also things like copyright protection and so on, that's a little bit more controversial, but that's included in the Convention on Cybercrime as well. So there is some regulation, but it's limited. Of course, your ISP can control what you see. Your ISP can put a filter on and say, nope, we don't want you looking at that website. And, but again, there are ways around it. There's proxy servers, there's VPNs, there's Tor, there's ways around it. ICANN potentially can control what you can see, because again, they could just delete the domain name. Someone puts a website up that ICANN doesn't like, ICANN could just say, right, we're getting rid of the domain name. Of course, they could then just get another domain name, but ICANN potentially could control what you can see. And of course, increasingly these days, social media providers, and again, we've kind of, we see this, and it's controversial on platforms like Facebook or Twitter or X as it now is, or YouTube. Who decides what will and will not be said on those platforms? In the case of X, of course, it's Elon Musk, who says he's in favour of absolute free speech, but is actually really probably only in favour of speech that he personally likes. YouTube, can be very censorious, and again, should they have this kind of power? They would argue that, well, it's our platform, our rules. If you want to use our platform, then you have to abide by our rules. But when these platforms are so important and relied upon by so many people, is it right that kind of censorship power should be held, at a whim of some unelected, unaccountable people? Of course, in the early days of the internet, it was about social norms. The early internet was a very, very interesting place. You won't remember it, but I do. And again, it was just, you knew how to conduct yourself online because If you didn't, you would get flamed, which meant you would get a barrage of abuse, basically. And you know, it was just kind of, there were certain norms grew up. People knew the expected standards of behaviour on the early internet. That's all kind of gone now. Again, state regulations, censorship. Governments can try to censor, they can try to regulate what we can see online, but again, their ability to do so is often limited. And it's also controversial. I mean, again, wider issues around free speech, and again, we don't have time to go into that. How far should freedom of speech go in a liberal democracy? I mean, I tend to be pro-free speech. You know, I tend to think that people should be able to say what they think, you know, even if that offends someone, up to a point. There have to be certain limits. I mean, you know, you can't have people going and inciting hatred, inciting violence, you know, going out and saying let's kick off. And well, I mean, a good example was the riots last summer, of course, and again, some of that was controversial. You know, people kind of been punished for things they'd said online, in some cases controversially. But I think we can't have people saying let's go and burn that hotel down with people in it. You know, you can't, have to put limits. You can't permit that. So I'm not a free speech absolutist, because I think that's a recipe for absolute chaos and you know, huge problems. But for the most part, I tend to think people should be free to say what they want within certain limits. But again, that's something that, you know, we can discuss, because it is a, you know, it is a topic which can be quite controversial. But again, how far does the state have the capacity to actually regulate anyway? How far can it limit what people can say? To what extent, you know, should internet control be centralised or should it be decentralised? You know, again, is there a need for centralised control? The idea of the digital divide. So this links into global inequalities. So again, the idea that some people, some communities, some countries have access to internet technology while others do not. And again, this exacerbates existing inequalities. It exacerbates existing patterns of dependency, for example. So again, if you've got all of the critical internet resources controlled by a few big corporations based in the global north, that's baking in an advantage that the global north has got, and it makes the global south, you know, it makes it that much harder for them to catch up, you know. So arguably, you know, it kind of bakes in existing inequalities into the, you know, the digital system. So we mentioned domain names as an example of that. Of course, cyber security is a huge issue, and again, we'll talk. I'm not going to talk about this much today, but we will be talking about that next year. If you do my understanding security module, we'll talk about cyber security there. But obviously, you know, everything from cyber crime, you know, illegal content, fraud, theft, hacking, malware, and again, it's common, you know, these days. We all experience someone trying to rip us off all the time. Disinformation, information warfare, up to full-on cyber terror and cyber warfare, digital attacks designed to cripple, you know, which potentially could have huge consequences, you know. It's fair to say, and cyberspace has been called the fifth dimension of modern warfare. So the traditional dimensions of warfare, well, there are two of them traditionally, which were land and sea. Of course, in the 20th century, air became the third dimension of warfare, aerial warfare, then space, but finally cyber. You know, so cyber now kind of recognised as the fifth dimensions of warfare. And again, it's real. It's not just a bit of an inconvenience. You know, cyber capabilities. I mean, you can imagine the damage that can be done. I mean, just imagine if someone hacked the stock market, or someone, started hacking the financial system and started deleting bank records. I mean, imagine the chaos and the economic damage that could be done by that. It could involve real loss of life. Imagine if someone hacked air traffic control and started crashing planes. It might sound like science fiction. 9/11 sounded like the plot of a movie until it actually happened. Or train control signals started crashing trains, or nuclear power stations started hack that and started messing about with control mechanisms, and you can imagine some of the potential consequences. So cyber is not just it's not just a minor concern. I mean, cyber warfare is a very, very real issue in modern warfare. So to kind of wrap up, obviously I've skimmed over a lot of very complex issues there, but the internet has evolved a great deal in my lifetime. I mean, again, you probably don't really remember a time before the internet. I mean, I don't technically, because I'm not quite that old. It's been around since 1969. But when I was a kid and into my sort of early 20s, the internet, it existed, but it wasn't a thing. It wasn't mainstream. And up until about 2000, it was mainly used by academics and geeks, and then it just kind of exploded as this critical infrastructure. And again, because societies and economies are now so dependent on the internet, it's not surprising that states and their governments have identified national interests in internet governance. But again, there's a huge question as to whether territorial nation states are the right entities to run what is a globalised, borderless medium. We've mentioned public-private governance and the idea of the multi-stakeholder model, the advantages and drawbacks of that. Debates around whether there should be a single ruling body for the internet, should it be centralised or should it be decentralised. The potential for democratisation, I think, is very, very important. And again, just coming back to this point, I think the revival of ICANN's democratic elections could point the way forward for governance arrangements in other areas of global politics. And again, this would require a bit of a paradigm shift in the way that we think about democracy, about governance, about citizenship. So again, the international system as we know it is based on the Westphalian system, and that's all we've known. But in some respects, as we've said before, this system is obsolete. Not in every respect, but in lots of emerging global issue areas, nation states don't cut it anymore. So global governance is required, but again, that then runs into these issues around democratic accountability. So again, a chap called David Held proposed a concept called global cosmopolitan democracy, and the idea is that citizenship would exist at multiple different levels. That yes, you would be a citizen of your nation state, and you would also be a citizen at local level. You would be a citizen of your town, your village, your local polity. You would be a citizen of your nation state, but you would also be a citizen at a higher level as well. You would be a global citizen, and you could participate in lots of different political communities existing at different levels. So the idea of global cosmopolitan democracy is the evolution of liberal democracy. And once again, internet governance institutions like ICANN could be the testing ground for exploring some of these possibilities. So this is why developments in internet governance, potentially have broader implications for the way that we conceptualise and think about citizenship and democracy and governance as we move further into the 21st century. So these issues matter, they're not just of interest to geeks, they are kind of real issues that really, have transformative power, I think, in the way that we think about citizenship and politics. Okay, that's, I think, all I wanted to cover. Anyone got any questions?